Hi, I'm back. Today I pick up with Thelonious Monk, His Life in Music. Let's see where we left off. Oh, before I forget. Seashells! Seashells. Because I'm always wishing I was at the beach. Okay, where are we? We're going to pick up with the chapter called The Monk Sound. It should be clear that anyone who grew up in the capital of America's musical life and devoted himself to the piano for hours a day from earliest youth does not play with a certain technique because of inability, but because he has consciously chosen it. When Monk wants to demonstrate fluency, as in his beloved whole tone runs, or the diatonic, occasionally chromatic, quadruplet, and quintuplet figures, he does so masterfully. In the area of tone production, too, belongs Monk's preference for the minor second. This has been differently interpreted as a pianistic approximation to quarter notes, whereby the note lying between two seminotes is implied. More careful observation reveals that the two notes of the interval are rarely played at equal volume. More often they are struck with different intensity, so that the more heavily accented one proper to the scale alone is sustained. This subtle blending of tones creates the impression that Monk is gliding from note to note, as when horn players produce blue notes via blending of the note. Milt Jackson would translate this keyboard-style technique of note bending to the vibraphone. Often these minor seconds are inserted as tonally veiled shorthand for a ninth chord. This brings us to another characteristic of Monk's sound. Over long stretches, his piano style is abrupt and markedly spare, as much vertical as horizontal. It is common for pauses to serve as contrasting elements of rhythm and sound. Then chords will unexpectedly appear that seem to destroy the tonality with their inclusion of notes far into the chord and even to the scale. All the better to affirm it indirectly in due course. The almost unconscious control of the composition with its harmonic framework is the basis for this masterful effusion of sound. Dizzy Gillespie's statement was valid even in the days of Minton's Playhouse. If you want to play with a monk, you have to have the composition and the harmony down cold. Otherwise, you turn around and suddenly are faced with the greatest difficulties. Ornette Coleman reproached players for changes by saying, "I want to play the music, not the background." That never applied to Monk, who by contrast worked with the whole structure of the piece in his solos, chords, initial rhythmic accents, and melody. All this went to realize his highly original idea of sound, the music, in short. On the basis of the vertical structure of a piece, Monk developed horizontal ideas that often have the character of brief, repeated variations on the piece's thematic and rhythmic material. With this approach, it is obvious that the manual division of labor standard in bebop, with the right hand playing single notes while the left hand sketches the underlying harmony, no longer serves. Monk's sound, especially on the solo recordings, depends on giving both hands equal time. In this respect, he can be said to belong to the tradition of the great Harlem stride pianist Even Art Tatum. It is interesting that Monk, whenever someone criticized him for being unable to articulate his phrases clearly, the way Art Tatum did, would reply ironically that he once played like Art Tatum, but found that it resulted in too many notes at once, and he was resolved to play only a few. The stride technique also was for him just one means among others of expressing sound, one to be sure that he revered. In any case, Monk's two-handed style of playing recalls Tatum and the stride pianist in that the left hand furnishes what in bebop is furnished by the rhythm section. The new role of the rhythm section led finally to the typical bebop development, whereby the left hand at the piano only sporadically supplied the chord changes to the right hand, which in turn imitated the melodic line of a horn. Monk's right hand, in contrast, does not play blowing lines. It condenses pianistically what a horn player would articulate in long runs, while the left juxtaposes bass lines or elliptical chords. Ultimately, it all serves the needs of his characteristic sound. Owing to his ambidextrous style of playing, Thelonious Monk was destined to be the first modern pianist to make definitive solo recordings. In fact, on his first solo album, recorded in Paris in 1954, he does not play much differently than on his earlier combo recordings. In these solo recordings, however, a further trait of the typical Monk sound emerges. The deeply probing horizontal developments draw a good part of their intensity from the rhythmic tension that results from the fact that in the coordination of the hands, often for whole measures at a time, neither one nor the other clearly marks time. In his later solo recordings, Monk came increasingly to exploit the opportunities for rubato inherent in this style. But even then, the rhythmic throb of his phrasing is so solid that the quality of the spring of the swing, even in free, delayed beats, remains strong. Alongside this rubato technique, Monk in his solo performances also reverted at appropriate moments to bass figures that help mark the beats. He derived these from stride and used them especially when performing standards. What emerges thereby is no parody, but a humorous transposition of the older material into Monk's own musical world. This process of transposition is all the more notable in that Monk never wanders too far from the theme, so that the melody lines always remain in the hearer's consciousness as a contrasting foil. And yet many of Monk's solo recordings, especially the album Solo Monk, owing to the wholesale importation of the slide technique, strike this reviewer as somewhat monotonous. The ensemble pianist. Thelonious Monk's personal style developed in an ensemble context. Minton's Playhouse at the beginning of the 40s. The most important innovation of the Minton Circle was in the area of rhythm. At the drum sat the man who, with his brightly pulsing beat, was responsible for the rhythmic conception of modern jazz, Kenny Clarke. He was at the same time the nominal leader. The generous Dizzy Gillespie, generous in his own contributions to jazz as well as in his judgments of others, affirmed Kenny Clarke's importance in no uncertain terms. The rhythmically contrapuntal accents in Clarke's playing have often been overrated for their significance in the development of jazz. The real significance of his approach lies in the liberating influence of his handling of the beat through his wonderfully sparkling use of the large cymbal. The beat is anchored there as securely as a metronome and yet flows so smoothly, or better, pulses like a heartbeat, that the tempo emerges freely breathing. Clarke himself described to me the influence of this new rhythmic approach in a conversation in Paris. What Parker and Gillespie did harmonically and melodically is already there in Bach and Beethoven. What really was new was the rhythm. Because I relaxed the hardness of the swing rhythm and liberated the beat, their ideas could first be realized. In this connection, one must not forget that this rhythmic scheme was foreshadowed in Kansas City Swing, which Clark and Monk had both experienced at first hand. The beat was not only liberated at the drum set, the piano also helped free it from the fetters of irregular measure-by-measure conformity. The bass, with its now audible supple tone, became the new slave to the rhythm, but could even consider this role empowering, since it now set the pace for the rhythmic and harmonic progressions. As regards piano accompaniment, an essential consideration was that it was spare, that it often sat out whole measures, the better to contribute contrasting accents key to the harmonic changes. Dizzy Gillespie, with an inventor's pride, claims to have introduced all pianists to this style of accompaniment. We should note, however, that, in essence, it is analogous to Clark's style of drumming, and so can be considered instead another product of Minton's rhythm team. After all, Dizzy Gillespie wrote on the photo of himself that he dedicated to Monk, and which decorated Monk's piano from the late 40s on. To Thelonious Monk, my first inspiration, stay with it. Your boy, Dizzy Gillespie. Let me show you this picture of Monk and Dizzy. It's sweet. Thelonious Monk conceived of accompaniment not only as a process of contributing harmonic highlights, but also as an opportunity to shape the underlying form. In bebop, it is customary to treat the theme as merely harmonic scaffolding. The theme is heard in full before and after the parade of solos, while the soloists themselves often pay it scant attention. Not so with Thelonious Monk. Not only do the basic motifs of the theme appear in his solos, but he also avails himself explicitly of the thematic material in his accompaniment. Thus, the whole number is of a thematic piece. In stark contrast, it is true, stands a method of accompaniment that reduces the spareness of bebop accompaniment to virtual non-accompaniment. Monk increasingly cultivated this for whole choruses, with the simple explanation that a pianoless rhythm section produced a whole new world of sound, especially in the horns, a world he particularly liked. In his solos performed in a compo setting, Thelonious traveled a path few other pianists have taken. The new support of the bass and drums did not encourage him to assign the harmonic signpost to the left hand, while reserving the melody to the right, a technique his protege Bud Powell was developed into a style all his own. With Monk, the newly empowered rhythm section led to a still more concentrated economy of expression and to the indiscriminate use of the right and left hand. Again, we have to reckon with the influence of Kansas City and Count Basie in particular. In Monk's case, sounds are distributed between either hand, which sometimes operate independently, sometimes in coordination to produce block chords dominated by the ninth interval. In the bass, the ninths are sometimes shortened to seconds. To be sure, the two-handed style is sometimes suspended altogether, not however in favor of horn-like melodic lines, but in order to startle the listener with one-handed minimal motifs that are starkly and percussively juxtaposed against the rhythmic flow. When people say that few pianists followed Monk's example, that should not be taken to mean that Monk's influence as a pianist was negligible. It is true that many musicians and jazz critics pay unreserved tribute to Monk the composer, while claiming that his pianistic influence was slight. But there are pianists who contest this evaluation. The pianist Mal Waldron, who along with Herbie Nichols, Rudy Weston, Cecil Taylor, and Richard Muhal Abrams, to name only the most prominent musicians, made pilgrimages to Minton's after the war, was emphatic when I questioned him on the subject. All the younger musicians loved him. He was not popular with the older musicians. The younger musicians felt that he was into something that was different. If people liked his compositions, they liked his playing. His playing was accepted. It was very strange sounding, very different sounding. Everybody was into being different at that time. And we looked up to Monk because he was more different than anybody else. And that was the keynote to jazz, to be different, to have your own personality. Cecil Taylor confirms the influence that Monk exercised upon him. It was also the realization of some things that I learned from Monk. That is, the placement of the chords in relation to the bass and drums, especially the bass, the steady element. Monk plays very subtly, more subtly than the eighth note playing of the boogie-woogie pianists and some of the younger players. As a result, he can jar you emotionally. A horn player playing with Monk must think faster, must think instantly, and Monk does not overblow. That was something I was working on around that time. Bag's Groove. The Bag's Groove. The Man I Love recordings made on Christmas Eve 1954 document Monk's qualities as an ensemble pianist in exemplary fashion. Among Miles Davis's works, these recordings are also often hailed as high points of improvisatory art. One illustrious critic of Monk, Andre Hodier, sees in his solo on Bag's Groove a moment of purest beauty in the history of jazz. For me, also, Bag's Groove represents one of the most perfect performances of ensemble jazz. The personnel itself was a stroke of especially good luck for Monk, even if the recordings bear the unmistakable stamp of the leader Miles Davis. The trumpeter in his early years belonged to the regular patrons at Monk's house seminars. After the recording sessions, he would also spend the rest of the day in Monk's home. The same goes for the vibraphonist Milt Jackson, whose wealth of melodic blues-infected ideas Monk had increasingly relied on as a foil to his own odd, abrupt, subtly modulated phrases. In the rhythm section sat Kenny Clarke, the man who, in close collaboration with Monk, was responsible for the rhythmic concept of modern jazz. Finally, in Percy Heath, you had a bassist who not only honored the new rhythmic responsibilities of the bass, but who also had absorbed the harmonic and melodic innovations of Oscar Pettiford and Ray Brown. With natural assurance and great sympathetic powers, he was able to exploit the opportunity to create patterns of contrapuntal bass lines. Seldom does one have the chance later to hear Monk play with so creative a bassist. Obviously, the jazz giants who were united for this recording session were deeply marked by Monk's musical ideas, so that for the time being at least, they formed a more musically coherent ensemble than many playing at the time. The tensions in the studio are in that regard no contradiction, and at bottom of no importance. It has been reported that Miles Davis compelled Monk to sit out the sessions after The Man I Love and Bimpsha Swing. Others believe that Monk resorted to his often attested practice of deliberate non-accompaniment. Kenny Clarke, in reviewing the whole controversy, will only say by way of personal reminiscence that Monk, during Davis's solos, actually had to excuse himself to go to the bathroom, and that he was notorious for getting his way. But what makes the first take of Bag's groove so special? The theme by Milt Baggs Jackson, essentially a simple, repeated 4-bar blues riff, is already part of the answer. It sounds earthy, bluesy, and yet entirely modern and open. It is this open quality that Miles Davis brings out in a solo of abstract, groundbreaking logic. After Miles's solo, Milt Jackson with vibrant imagination highlights the earthy, bluesy element which, thanks in part to the sound of his instrument, does not clash with the coolness of Davis. Monk at the piano elaborates on Jackson's ideas with blues chords that sound with their tendency toward atonality as if they were hardening into abstraction. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe. Catch me in the next video. May you find